Do you know what it means to be loved by death? Do you know what it means to have death know your name? Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel where I talk about books, literary, horror, classics, and contemporary. However, in this video, I'm narrowing the focus and I'm going to talk specifically about horror books from the 1970s. And because there are so many great and important horror books from the 1970s, I've decided to break that decade into 3 parts and create from this video a trilogy, assuming there's interest. So in this video, I'm going to talk specifically about horror books from 1970 to 1973. If you're new to this channel, consider subscribing. I do appreciate the support and I do need the growth to keep me motivated and keep me putting out videos. Now, one thing I love about horror books from the 1970s is the covers. So I've prepared a short montage featuring some excellent book covers from that decade and featuring the music of Alfred Schnittke. So I'll see you on the other side to talk about some great and important horror books from the early 1970s. So unique. Well, like all horror, or fiction of any kind for that matter, it is to an extent a product of its time, a reflection of the values, the concerns, and interests of society at that time. And the 1970s was a decade of transition. The 1960s had given us the birth control pill, free love, a sexual revolution, and the rise of psychedelics. But at the end of that decade, the Beatles broke up, the Matheson family went on a gruesome murder spree, and some of the decade's cultural icons, Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, died, and of drug overdoses, no less. So by 1970, the party was over, and it had come to an abrupt and complete end. In its wake rose, especially in North America, a reversion to more traditional family values, and accompanied by, if not spearheaded by, the rise of a peculiar brand of Christian fundamentalism, which enjoyed tremendous success in that decade. Now, to a large extent, at least in the 20th century, there is something subversive about horror. It goes against the status quo. It subverts the societal, cultural, and political movements of the time, while at the same time playing into the fears that these trends spark. So with the end of the decade of free love, horror went with that in the 1970s and gave us sex as an expression of evil and thus a source of terror. And with a call to more traditional family values, 1970s horror subverted that and gave us the terror of the traditional family unit. So instead of the boogeyman or monsters from beyond, in 1970s horror, the monster comes from within the family unit. The villain is the mother or the father, and the monsters are often the children. 1970s horror is notably marked by a prevalence of killer kids and the evil child trope. Case in point, The Other by Thomas Tryon from 1971. 13-year-old twins, one good, one evil, and they have psychic powers, which is another aspect of 1970s horror we'll get to later on in the video. Unfortunately, the loss of their father due to a tragic accident has left their mother in a state of shock. So they spend the summer with their grandmother and some other people at the family's farmhouse where no one is safe. How could they be safe around the children? I can't tell you more about the plot because the book works to mislead the reader, building to a climactic plot twist, which was quite iconic at the time. And it's pretty good. It still works today, I think. I will tell you that this book is considered a classic. It's iconic, and it's a good example of the evil kid trope that was especially popular in the 1970s. But to be honest with you, I didn't really love the book as much as everyone else seemed to. And that's partly due to the fact that I had a hard time following the story. It's written in multiple POVs. There are passages from a first-person account that is not one of the kids, and then it shifts to a third-person omniscient for some scenes. Plus, we're dealing with twins, and sneaky, conniving twins, no less. So I had a difficult time following what was going on in this book. But to keep this channel positive, to keep this video positive, I will read an excerpt from a 5-star review, which is indicative of what many readers think of this classic. Quote, "I was truly entertained by a relatively pastoral childhood that gradually became darker with all those accidental mishaps. It becomes increasingly more interesting until it pretty much blew me away. I'm not saying that it wasn't predictable at a certain point, of course, but the resolution was completely top-notch. You know the story about the evil twin, yeah? This is the granddaddy of them all, and easily the best one of its kind." If you're going to read this iconic killer kid, evil twin book, know that a large part of the enjoyment of this book is dependent on the plot twist. And how effective the plot twist is on you will be determined by how well you're following the story. And I can tell you it's not that easy to follow the story, I think. It wasn't for me. And after perusing dozens and dozens of reviews for this book, I can tell you I was not alone in having difficulty following the story. But I can recognize, even if I didn't enjoy the book really, I can recognize that it is an intriguing and good story with an intriguing and iconic plot twist. If 1970s horror in its subversiveness introduced the fear of the traditional family unit, it is not only the children we need to be afraid of, but the spouse, the husband, the wife. And this is where 1970s horror marries with another cultural movement at that time, which was called in the United States the second wave of feminism. Now, the second wave of feminism started in the early 1960s, but it was in the 1970s that it was picked up by the horror community as it played very nicely with the fear of the family trope. In the horror of the 1970s, we have the role of the traditional stay-at-home subservient housewife, the role itself as a source of terror. And there are two excellent examples of this from the early 1970s. Both rank among my favorite horror books of all time. The first being The Stepford Wives by Ira Levin from 1972. I've talked about this book several times already. I've talked about it in my ranking of all the Ira Levin books. Spoiler alert, it ranks at number 1, ahead of Rosemary's Baby. I also talk about it in my favorite horror books of all time, where it doesn't rank number 1, but it ranks quite high. The Stepford Wives works as horror. There is something wrong, something unnatural about a stay-at-home subservient wife, something horrific even. And it also works as a satire on consumerism, how women are marketed to, as their role should be to keep the home clean and keep their husbands happy, and that role can only be accomplished through the products that they buy. So I think it's a brilliant work. It's 120 pages or so, and it's both scary and funny, and it's quite impressive how layered a story he created with so few pages. Even if you know the story from movie adaptations or parodies of it, the enjoyment of the book is not reliant on any twist. Even if you're familiar with the plot, that should not diminish your enjoyment of the book. If you haven't already, I highly recommend checking out this iconic 1970s horror classic. In a similar vein, the role of the stay-at-home housewife being a source of terror, we have another one of my favorite horror books of all time, and that is Burnt Offerings by Robert Morasco from 1973. I talked about this book in my video 4 Unique Haunted House Recommendations. In Burnt Offerings, the wife of this family, she is obsessed with keeping the home clean and making it beautiful. Which is what society in the early 1970s is calling women to become again. But in Burnt Offerings, this is the source of terror. So she is obsessed with keeping the home clean and making it beautiful. And the home, a summer rental actually, feeds off of her obsession. And it rewards her for it. But eventually it becomes more and more demanding, asking of her not only cleanliness and beauty, but asking of her burnt offerings. Now I'd like to talk about another aspect of 1970s horror that is quite unique to that decade, and that is in the way it treats paranormal phenomena. Parapsychology, or the concept of kinetic powers or psychic abilities, this idea had been around long before the 1970s, but for some reason, and I'm not sure exactly why, but it received a tremendous boom of interest and even belief in parapsychology in the 1970s. And with it came a certain amount of respectability in the field, as this belief, this interest married with or came from academia. There were a lot of institutions created in the 1970s to research parapsychology. For example, the Institute of Parascience, the Academy of Religion and Psychical Research, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, the International Kirlian Research Association, and the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, etc., etc., etc. This fascination naturally bled into horror and gave us works such as Stephen King's Carrie in 1974, or John Farris's The Fury in 1976, or Thomas Tryon's The Other in 1971, to name but a few examples. What's interesting is that the idea of people possessing psychic powers is treated not in a fantastical way in the 1970s horror, but it's treated as if it were a legitimate possibility. People with kinetic powers, psychic abilities, this idea in the 1970s enjoyed a fair amount of mainstream success, and it's treated as such in the horror of the 1970s. One notable example of this is Hell House by Richard Matheson from 1971. In Hell House, a group of psychics or mediums go to a house that is haunted with psychic energy. There is one token skeptic in the group, but even he believes in the power. He just doubts that some of the mediums in his company are legitimate. The tone of this book is very 1970s, and the way it just presents psychic phenomena as if it were a natural and obvious occurrence. There is another aspect of this book that truly makes it 1970s, and that is in the way it deals with sex. Remember, we're coming from the end of the decade of free love, so now sex, not for procreation but for pleasure, is evil and dangerous, and it will result in a lot of terrible things happening. So Hell House takes this idea, this part of the zeitgeist of that time, and it cranks it up to 11. The house where these psychics go to do their research, it had been inhabited by a cult whose leader had psychic abilities, obviously. And the cults, they were really just interested in having orgies. Orgies after orgies after orgies. And in fact, they were so consumed and so interested with having orgies that They literally just had so many orgies that they didn't eat and they didn't hydrate. They literally sexed themselves to death. And in fact, the only descriptions we really get in detail of Hell House are of the murals which depict these orgies. This book is bonkers. It takes the idea of psychic powers being obvious and sex being evil and leading to terrible things. It goes over the top with both of those things. It makes for a very dated book, and I think it was initially created to be scary, but reading it from my 21st century point of view, I thought it was super silly and just crazy. And to be honest with you, I didn't really enjoy it, but that was because I had read another one of Richard Matheson's book from the 1950s, I Am Legend, which I thought was brilliant. I thought it was literary and scary, and I was expecting the same thing with Hell House. So I went into Hell House with the wrong expectations. Hell House is bonkers, nuts, and I think it could be loads of fun if you go into it with the right mindset, with the right set of expectations. It's very dated, it's very 1970s, but I think it gives us a good time capsule of what was so unique and I think quite charming about horror from that decade. So this will conclude my look at the early part of the 1970s horror. I'm hoping to get a good reaction from this video, and so I can continue into the middle years of that decade, which gave us some great and crazy horror stories. So what do you think of horror from the 1970s? What is it about that decade that you love? What are some of your favorite horror books from that decade? Do you have any experience with the books that I mentioned in this video? I'd love to hear your reactions. Thank you for watching. I'll see you at the next video.